Yan, live tayo guys. Kamusta naman kayo dyan? Ayan, nakaabol tayo sa meta. I really wanted to do this earlier but as you can imagine, medyo sobrang grabing busy natin. I mean, through the night, I had to write obituaries for President Ramos, looking at his legacy and what it means for our country. Makikita niya actually ngayon live. It's now live on Nikkei Asia. Nikkei Asia. So, makikita niyo dito yung aking obituary for President Ramos, his complicated legacy, and how at the same time he personally eschewed dynastic politics and helped consolidate our democracy, not only bring down a dictatorship. So we'll discuss it a little bit later on. So throughout the day, no, I think I had to finish like 4 articles, 4,000 words. So medyo, uh, I hope I'm still coherent and hindi tayo ubus ng energy. But so today we'll quickly try to discuss itong legacy ni Ramos. But as you may know, hindi lang uh, I mean, today is also the anniversary ng, the passing of former President Corazon Aquino. So medyo back-to-back siya. So I think it's important for us to put the legacy of those two presidents, no, who collaborated in making sure we transition into democracy into proper perspective. At the same time, I think it's a measure of how polarized our country is, and it's a measure of how ignorant the level of political discourse in this country is. When you see marami nag-iinsulto dyan at nagka-comment ng sobrang walang kwenta, and not showing whatever respect whatsoever, no, to key political figures who just passed away. As I said, you're free to express criticism of anyone, including and especially political figures, but konting respeto naman. So, let me just say you personally, despite my reservations with many policies of former President Duterte, whenever I heard that he is unwell or he's going under checkup, etc., I try to put aside the political analysis and be a human. No? So, whether kayo ay bumoto sa etong camp or kabilang camp, at the end of the day, guys, these people have been, they were our presidents, they were our leaders. They have left imprint on our political landscape. Yung fate ng ating bansa, in many ways, was determined by the actions or inactions of these people. And a lot of these people who ended up as our presidents were not necessarily bad people. And I would argue that Corazon Aquino and also Fidel Ramos were among the better intentioned and well-intentioned leaders we have had. And I think their legacy in relative terms, in terms of contribution to our democratic aspirations, in terms of making sure na hindi tayo babalik sa isang dictatorship, that was largely commendable. Now, obviously, before, of course, we're discussing the legacy of these two presidents we have had, especially more on Ramos and why I believe Ramos was still the best president we have had in at least past half a century. Let me, of course, be clear that this is not going to be a hagiography or a kind of a partisan kind of presentation or discussion. Of course, aminado tayo na may pagkakulang yung mga iba't ibang presidente natin. Of course, many people have raised concerns with the inability of the Corazon administration, for instance, in instituting isang radical and effective land reform program. Yung pagbabalik ng mga iba't ibang oligarchies, and political elites to top positions of government. The absence, for instance, of strong laws to ensure na magkakaroon tayo ng mga tunay na political parties. Many loopholes and deficiencies dun sa 1987 Constitution. So you can raise a lot of criticisms. I would also say, taking note from what my former professor Winnie Munsut kept on mentioning in her classes in UP School of Economics. She always talked about yung debt legacy ng Marcoses and the inability or unwillingness of the Corazon administration in renegotiating them, or for legally, you could have contested a lot of those debt because they were technically odious debt. No, so hindi tayo nandito para sabihin na anghel ang itong mga presidente natin. No, with Ramos, of course, you can say that he was at the upper echelons of the security establishment during the Marcos dictatorship. He was the chief of the constabulary and domestic law enforcers for in the crucial years of the Marcos era. So obviously, we cannot erase that away. Pwede ka rin mag-criticize ng deleterious impact ng kanyang privatization in the 1990s, which helped concentrate economic resources in the hands of few political families. You can also, some progressives would even criticize Ramos for kind of bringing back the Americans under the Visiting Forces Agreement. So you can go on and on and on. And obviously, none of these presidents were perfect. But at the same time, let's not forget that these were among the two, I would say, more patriotic, hardworking, and dedicated leaders we have had. In the case of Corazon Aquino, of course, because an anniversary ng, it's her, I think, 13th anniversary of her death. I mean, she could have become, I mean, if she were greedy with power, she could have become a dictator in her own right, right? Uh, because when the Marcos dictatorship was toppled, and it was toppled not in the ways that you'll see in those Marites fake propaganda movies na lalabas soon. Obviously, I'm not talking about Katips, which by the way is doing very well. Nanalo pala nung director ng Katips, both Best Director and Best Actor. Ibang klase. Only in the Philippines. So sa Wednesday, no, magkakaalaman na. I'm obviously not talking about that real movie by real artists and real directors. Now the reality is that, for months at least, before the promulgation of the 1987 Constitution, Corazon Aquino could have wielded essentially dictatorial power permanently, or at least for a long period of time. She chose not to do that. She chose to press ahead with the democratization of the political order. So in many ways, that shows she was not greedy for power. Now, at the same time, hindi mo rin pwedeng sisisiin si Corazon Aquino for not implementing a lot of draconian policies because she didn't control the military. Kung maalala niyo, paano ni Corazon Aquino, we had more than half a dozen coups d'etats. And one reason we had a lot of coups was because the military was heavily politicized in the most toxic way possible during the Marcos era. So as Marcos laid the foundation for declaring martial law, he politicized the upper echelons of the military. He quadrupled their salaries. He put a lot of people, including distant relatives like Ramos, in key positions of the government and the security establishment. So Corazon Aquino inherited a very toxic, polarized, politicized military. And at some point, muntik namatay yung mga Aquinos. No? So as you may know, former President Benigno Aquino, whose obituary I also wrote for Nikkei Asia last year, he had a bullet in his neck because I think ito yung time na nag-RPG yata. Hindi pala, shrapnel pala, doon sa grenade ba yan or RPG na ginamit ng ito yung mga Honasan people, di ba? Nung sumugod sila sa Malacanang in one of the coups during the 1980s. No? These were the years of trouble as far as the Philippines is concerned. So obviously, Corazon Aquino also inherited an extremely difficult civil-military relations situation. Not to mention, she inherited what? 25, 24, 26 billion dollars in debt. A lot of that gobbled up by the cronies of the former dictatorship. She inherited a very difficult also position as far as domestic insurgencies are concerned. Again, hindi kasalanan ni Corazon Aquino na nagkaroon ng giyera sa Mindanao. Again, this goes back to the Marcos era, right? The war with MNLF, for instance. The war with the NPA and communist movement. A lot of that, the worst years were actually during the Marcos dictatorship. Again, these are facts, right? Now, obviously, you could say that she could have done more. She could have transcended the moment, etc. But the reality is that, in many ways, she shepherded our transition, gave a hope to our democratic aspirations, which in many ways undergirded the 1986 People Power Revolt against the Marcoses. Now, I can go more and more into Cory, but probably that should be left for another discussion because, isa sa mga parating inisip is that I think Corazon Aquino and Ramos, they deserve better historians, better intellectuals, better artists to really give a fair narrative about their legacy. Kasi nangyari dito is either super anti or super parang sinasanto. When the reality is that these were just human beings, right? Who had their own matrix of mistakes and shortcomings, at the same time great intentions and even good legacies. So ang kailangan po natin is a new, fresh eye and narrative that puts their legacy into proper perspective and affords them the deserving or deserved place of pride as far as the pantheon of our leaders are concerned. As I said, again, the bar is so low. Unfortunately, we have had one of the worst presidents anywhere in the developing world, and even compared to our Southeast Asian leaders. So I think in comparison, Corazon Aquino and Ramos were among our better presidents. Now, going to Ramos, again, we can discuss more about Corazon Aquino, but going to Ramos, you see, 1992 was a crucial year. Now, yes, Ramos was part of the upper echelons ng Marcos regime. Yes, he was part of that system. Pero yung decision niya na mag-turn against the Marcos dictatorship in 1986 by launching a kind of a very risky coup attempt together with Enrile, who, by the way, is now the national security advisor. It's the legal advisor of Marcos Jr. That tells you how different these two men were, really. That decision of Ramos to go against Marcos was very crucial. In fact, historians and a lot of political scientists, they do not define the People Power Revolution of 1996 as a normal civilian revolution. They describe it as a civilian-backed coup. Because kung hindi nagkaroon yung coup na yan by Ramos, by Enrile, I don't think the Filipino people would have been in a position to topple the Marcos dictatorship. Because there were still a lot of people in the military who backed the Marcos dictatorship. And there were some people in the US government who were still backing the Marcos dictatorship. So that split within the military defense establishment of the Marcos was very crucial in empowering the Filipino people, yung mga sumali sa EDSA, to topple that decadent, rapacious regime. So that was very crucial. Now, people forget what happens 6 years later, because 6 years later, Corazon Aquino barely survives all of these coups d'etats. Our economy is still in tatters, thanks to what we inherited from before, all the debt, all the crisis, the damage to the institutions. Halos bankrupt lahat ng mga state-owned enterprises. Now, Ramos' elections in 1992 was crucial because kung hindi nanalo si Ramos at kung nagsama ng puwersa ang mga loyalista, so in this case, I'm talking about Danding Coangco and Imelda Marcos, the Marcoses would have been back in Malacanang as early as 1992. Not 2016, not 2022, but 1992. Noon pa lang, pwede sila makabalik. They had enough number of loyalist base to get back to power. And in fact, later on, 6 years later, after Ramos, Estrada, another semi-loyalist, or was able to become president, also partly because of the support of the loyalists. No? So in 1992, Ramos essentially prevented the total collapse of that fledgling, fragile democracy that Corazon Aquino and others were trying to establish. Obviously, as I said, marami pagkakulang nangyari from 1986 to 1992. Kaya nga, our democracy was facing, or our democratic aspiration and project was facing its darkest hour. Now, Ramos wins with one of the slimmest margins, if not the slimmest margin, of any victorious presidential candidate. Not even 24%. So we're talking about 23.5%. I mean, my goodness, right? Barely a fourth voted for Ramos. And yet, despite having one of the slimmest margins, he was able to put the country together. So one of the most important things that Ramos did, and this is where the concept of democratic consolidation comes to picture. So, kung classroom ito, ganito, yung concept of democratic consolidation is this. It's one thing for you to introduce elections, right? It's another thing for you to ensure elections are fair and competitive. It's another thing to make sure all political factions in the country consider elections, competitive elections, as the only game in town in determining who becomes the president and who occupies the top positions of the government. Now, Ramos helped consolidate our democracy, so democratic consolidation is a term we use in political science, by essentially ending the coups. So being a former defense minister, military chief, among others, he leveraged that to make sure na hindi na magkakaroon ng coup d'etat. So those rebellious officers and soldiers were shunted back into the barracks. Ending those coup d'etats was extremely important to ensuring the survival of the democratic project. Had Ramos not done that, or someone more incompetent or someone authoritarian been in power in 1992, I don't think our democracy could have survived. We were really in a serious crisis. Kumbaga on life support system na yung ating demokrasya and almost going into coma. Now, Ramos ended the coups. But he didn't only end the coups. One of the great things he did was he appointed a lot of top economists and experts, some of whom we didn't even vote for him. You don't believe me? Ask Chelito Habito, right? He's NEDA secretary, my fellow columnist on Philippine Daily Inquirer. Abangan niya yung column niya tomorrow. I'm sure he's going to say a lot about his time with President Ramos. You see, President Ramos arguably assembled the most competent team, the best and brightest as far as we know, right? Including people who didn't vote for him. So it was really based on meritocracy and technocratic competence. During his time, our economic growth was back. Because we lost a whole decade. The whole 1980s was a lost decade for Philippines economically. Massive disaster. And to blame Corazon Aquino solely for that and forgetting what she inherited from a 2-decade long Marcos era is ridiculous, right? You don't know, where's your logic, right? Now, mabait na ako, I'm controlling myself. Now, going back to this, 1990s, finally we're back to economic growth. And not only to back to economic growth, but major inclusive development. In fact, poverty rates go down from 39% in around 1991-92 to 31%, right? That's close to a quarter reduction in poverty rates. Meron siyang Vision Philippines 2000, whereby he wanted to make us a tiger economy again. And I think that would have been likely had it not been for Asian financial crisis in 1997 and the other unfortunate thing for him, Erap Estrada following after his footsteps in 1998. So one of the biggest tragedies for Ramos is his term ended on a sour note, right? The Asian financial crisis and then yung uptick in kidnapping cases, etc. But you see, Ramos still, he saved our democratic project. He prevented it from collapse in its darkest hour. It was on life support. Now it's a little bit out of life support, pwede na siya maglakad. Now, as you know, Ramos is also workaholic. A lot of Ilocanos are. Now, he's not the only Ilocano president I've talked to. I've talked in Ilocano briefly with 3 different presidents. You can imagine who are these people. I'm not going to name names. But obviously, Ramos was a favorite for a lot of reasons, including, especially because of his legacy. Now, going back to Ramos, he was extremely hardworking. This guy would play golf and then run after his own ball, right? This guy would jog from early morning and shame his younger staff into getting a more healthy lifestyle. When I met him 2019, he punched me just jokingly and sobrang masakit siya. And that was, nakita niyo yung picture na ganyan. Actually, masakit siya. He was just trying to show me malakas pa rin siya, but I think he overdid it. But no bad blood. First time I saw in person, like face-to-face kami nag-talk, this was 2016, nagpo-push up siya doon sa interview room bago kami ma-interview ni Jessica So, doon sa president ni Digong. No? So, I mean, this guy is singular. Right? I haven't seen anyone like him. I think he's the closest thing we have had to Mahathir of Malaysia or Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, except he only had 6 years in office. And his push for parliamentary system, it got big rejection, most especially from Corazon Aquino. So who knows, if he had 10 years in office under a parliamentary system, maybe he could have had a much more consequential even legacy. But the least thing that he did was to stabilize our economy and the coups, and that saved, essentially took our democratic project out of the coma, almost coma level, out of the life support situation. That, for me, is the most important legacy he has had. And I think he really deserves a lot of respect and recognition for that. Now, going back to this again, during his time also, you see, he's a former soldier and general himself, and yet he served in the Vietnam and Korean wars against communist forces. I mean, this guy is quite something. No? Now, Ramos was also a great peacemaker and diplomat, right? He's considered as one of the elder statesmen of Asia. He was very active in ASEAN integration, in broader East Asia level integration. If you go abroad, he's the only really respected president we have had as far as regional geopolitics is concerned. No offense kay Tatay, no offense dun sa mga iba na trying hard na maging regional leader, etc. Now, I'm talking about Ramos. He was really, truly respected abroad for his foreign policy. He was also very adept in terms of playing multiple powers against each other and engaging and deterring China at once. So he would do one day karaoke diplomacy with Jiang Zemin of China. The next thing, he'll send fighter jets to defend our situation in Mischief Reef. When the Americans proved useless, he pressured them to be more useful by pushing for the Visiting Forces Agreement, while developing the armed forces of the Philippines by pushing for AFP modernization, while pushing for ASEAN-level support, which later on paved the way in the early 2000s for the declaration and the conduct of parties in the South China Sea. So all of these things were together. In fact, one reason we got to talk to each other is because he read my works on his foreign policy. And in one of my panel talks a few years ago, siya pa yung nagtatanong doon sa panel talk namin. Biglang nagtatanong si Ramos, nako, ano sasabihin niya? So he was reading some of his stuff that I was writing about our diplomatic response to China's encroachment to West Philippines in 1990s pa lang. So wala pang Scarborough Shoal to eh. Panganiban Reef pa lang pinag-usapan natin. So, he was multitasking, moving on multiple fronts, and pretty competently, in fairness to the guy, and he was not 40s by then. So, papunta na yata siya sa 60s, diba? So, that's quite incredible for him doing that. And as I said, the tragedy for him is that, and now, balik tayo dito, kasi may mga medyo bastos dyan na nagko-comment na, they say, oh, boy benta, boy ganon. Like, use your brain. Why do you think he had to sell your gray matter, whatever is left of I'm talking to the trolls? Like, why do you think he had to sell a lot of those government-owned enterprises? Because they were bankrupt. Why do you think they were bankrupt? Because they were bankrupted by a rapacious, decadent, corrupt dictatorship, right? So wala siyang choice, right? He had to privatize a lot of them. Now, I take issue with how the privatization was perhaps conducted. I take issue with how the privatization benefited certain big conglomerates and families. Let's be very clear about that. But to just call him Boy Benta while forgetting the context that pa-bankrupt na halos yung mga ibang major state-owned enterprises natin, that's disingenuous. Worse than that, that's idiocy, right? So put that into context. Now, don't also forget that Ramos used special powers given by the Congress not to be a dictator, but to end the electricity crisis in the country. More than that, he broke up, he was able to break up a number of monopolies dun sa telecommunications sector natin. And he also oversaw the beginning of some of these new public-private partnership infrastructure projects. So a lot of modern infrastructure we are having, Ramos kind of got the ball rolling. So again, he deserved, I think, respect and recognition for that. So just say Boy Benta while forgetting what situation we were in. You don't know what you're talking about, all right? Umayos ka. All right. Now, as I said, the privatization could have been done better. As I said, in some ways, the privatization perhaps went wrong, right? Kaya ang taas ng utility costs natin and all. But to put things into context, right? As I said, privatization could have been done. But to put things into context, he was acting from a position of almost desperation. Because wala na yung coffers of the state. The economy was in tatters, etc. But at the same time, guys, he was able to break apart a lot of monopolies, right? In telecom, etc. You know who I'm talking about, no? So, paki-research naman yung mga ganon, no? So, we have to put that in context. But as I said, you see, another thing that really made Ramos for me special, and I think this is really the thrust of my take on his legacy, is his redemptive politics. You see, many times in his life, you could argue that he made the mistake of supporting budding despots. One was his distant relative, right, who would put him in charge of the police and constabulary, but he would turn against that guy later on in 1986. The other one was Digong. So in 2015, 2016, Ramos apparently was Roro, all right? Rodrigo Robredo, right? So he supported Robredo. That's why a lot of Ramos cabinet members and supporters supported Robredo, Leni Robredo, these elections. But he supported Rodrigo Duterte. And many people took issue with that. And many people are saying, well, didn't you learn your lesson, for heaven's sake, after what happened in the past? And by the way, I raised those questions with him. I even raised the question of why the military was so politicized during the Marcos era. We had some discussions about that. Of course, I respect the privacy of that conversation, so I cannot divulge here in my responses now. But I put those questions to him because I wanted to be fair and give him a chance. Now, one of the things I keep on hearing is that sabi niya, tanongin mo na lang si Ambet Ocampo. Kasi si Ambet Ocampo yata may ginagawang book about Ramos' legacy. So, hintayin natin siya. And by the way, I'm organizing an interview also with Ambet Ocampo. Pag-usapan natin later this week, God willing. Chismisan natin yung mga pelikula na lalabas. But also, we'll go to more serious issues like Corazon Aquino, Ramos, their legacy, etc. Now, going back to this, yes, it's true that Ramos supported Digong. But, not long after, he corrected that. More than corrected that. Right? So when Duterte was becoming super pro-China, even though Ramos was the one who made the first initial contacts with high-level officials in China to pave the way for kind of a restoration of ties. So he had a meeting in Hong Kong with a top Chinese official, a former ambassador to the Philippines. I've written on that. I can share that with you. Once he saw this is going off the rail, he spoke up. He spoke out and he spoke up. So, and interestingly, he criticized Duterte's anti-Western tirades in ways that was more personal than about national interest. So in a meeting just next to the outgoing U.S. ambassador earlier in the Duterte term, he said, what we need is an interdependent foreign policy, which leverages our networks of allies, trusted, tested allies, instead of jumping into the embrace of new imperial powers under the thin veneer of independent foreign policy kuno, pero actually you're just changing one strategic patron for the other, especially because your other patron is not questioning your human rights record and drug war and extrajudicial killing situation and all of that, right? Never mind that power is actually encroaching into our waters in the West Philippine Sea. So Ramos called it out. Ramos also said na big insult yung paglibing ng dating diktador doon sa Cemetery of National Heroes. He said it's an insult to the AFP, to our soldiers and our policemen. He didn't have to say it. I mean, if he wanted to be friends with Duterte, but he said that. He also later on questioned the drug war. He said, if may nanlaban na situation, just like the military, may rules of engagement. You shoot to disable, you don't shoot to kill. So he questioned the extrajudicial killings and called for a more humane version of a drug war or a counter-narcotics operation. So on multiple occasions, we saw the politics of redemption there. He may have made mistakes, etc., but later on, he tried to correct that, or he did something about it more concretely, right? So that's very important. Now, another thing that makes also Ramos quite special is he did not create his own political dynasty. So if you look at a lot of our presidents, they're either products of dynasties or perpetuated those dynasties. In the case of Ramos, wala sa anak niya or asawa niya pumasok or tinrato yung elected office parang family business, right? Now, compared that to some of more you know who, right? Yung mga tatay niya presidential, gano'n. Yung isa yung presidential, anak niya gusto maging president. Yeah, like, he didn't do that. And in ways, there was a Mandela touch to that because Mandela in South Africa also tried to make sure that at least his children don't get into politics and he doesn't create a new dynasty because he didn't want them to perpetuate a corrupt system, but instead stay above the fray and be a symbol of good governance and visionary leadership. Now, speaking of Mandela, kutup ko, that was also the reason why Ramos allowed the Marcoses to get back and reestablish their foothold in Ilocos region in the north. Now, many have questioned him and his DILG secretary. Ano pangalan ng guy na yun? And then DDS, tapos biglang pro-Robredo, tapos hindi ko alam anong gagawin yung next. Ay, naku, ito yung mga ganyan tao. Basta yung, di ba, isang criticism sa mga Ramos is that they allowed yung pagbalik ng, remains of the former dictators in the north and, essentially allowed them to reestablish their foothold in the north and from there work their way back to Malacanang over the next 3 decades. But I think a part of that was also Ramos' vision of reconciliation, kind of yung nangyari sa South Africa, right? Except in South Africa, there was a very institutionalized process of truth and reconciliation, right? Very institutionalized then. I don't think that happened in the Philippines. Not to mention, judicial impunity is even worse here in the Philippines, perhaps, than a lot of other fledgling democracies. But I think there was a good intention, although ill-fated siguro yung nangyari dyan. But you see, part of me feels, and probably if I'm gonna write a novel, one of the chapters will open like this: Ramos sitting down, few weeks before passing away, and he's watching the inauguration of Marcos Jr. While at the same time, keeping in mind that his buddy buds in 1986, Enrile, is going to be the legal advisor of the Marcos Jr., this princeling. I mean, I don't know what he was feeling then. I mean, obviously he was not in his best shape, but the guy is a deep thinker and he has a lot of emotions. And he was watching the inauguration of a princeling who's going to take over the same Malacanang, the same office he served with, full dedication, and under a democratic order, he helped birth into being. So I don't know. I mean, that's the stuff of novels. I don't think you can capture that with political analysis prose. I think that's only something you can capture in a novel or literary work. So that's something that's at the back of my head. A chapter should open with Ramos sitting down there and watching Marcos Jr. becoming the next president of the Philippines. I don't know what he was feeling. But anyway, he was not perfect. As I said, you can make a lot of issues out of his legacy. But I don't know. I would argue that he was the best president we have had because of the fact that, you could see in my writing, so I posted my article where he was the best president. I mean, just, again, bar is very low, but let's put it into context. I mean, this was a guy, right? I want to stick to exactly the prose I used. He was a leader who not only understood the importance of institutions, he wanted a strong state, not strong men, but also adopted a visionary style of governance based on technocratic merit rather than nepotism. Actually, to Habito and a lot of smart guys who got into his cabinet. Empirical evidence rather than outlandish claims. And a good measure of personal discipline and competence, almost workaholic level, rather than populist know-nothings and performative nonsense that we have been seeing in recent years. Well, unfortunately, it works for politicians and trapos, but not for the country over the long run. I don't know. I mean, and as I said, I mean, 4 things really made him special. I mean, first of all, I think he was the most educated president we have had. I mean, not only engineering background in West Point, he had multiple master's degree from top universities. So I don't know, ang dami sinasabi na brilliance si Marcos, ganun. But I think Ramos was smarter in many ways. If you look at him, he also simultaneously oversaw economic growth and democratic consolidation in very difficult times, and also successful peace negotiations. Aquino was not able to get the third one. He got some economic growth, he got democratic consolidation, but he didn't get he didn't get the successful peace process to its logical end dahil nga sa mamasapano, 'di ba? I mean, in a way, both Aquino and Ramos did not end on the best note, and their tragedies that they were followed by populist leaders who undermined a lot of their good legacies. Or when they continued their good legacy, some part of that they didn't recognize it and sinisira lang sila. No? The other thing is Ramos, again, asked Chelito a bit about this. He was really about merit rather than nepotism. I mean, obviously there will be political appointments, some calculations here and there, good Machiavellian moves, to put it as some friends put it. But in many ways, his cabinet was really best and brightest. I talked to a lot of Philippine political scientists and experts around the country, and they would say, like, they worked under different administrations, but the Ramos one was by far the best, like, by far the best. And, he correctly saw leadership as teamwork, not a cult of personality. And as I said, similar to Mandela, he didn't create his own political dynasty. Fourth, and most importantly, he believed in a strong state, as I said, right, in strong man. And I think he learned he learned a lot from how the dictatorship in the 70s and 80s really went off the rail and undermined the country. No. But as I said, if there's one way I can put him, as far as his legacy is concerned, is he's a redemptive figure, right? He backed perhaps the wrong people on multiple occasions, but he had the humility and wisdom and the moral conviction to try to correct it, sometimes more successfully than others. And for that, I think he deserves a lot of respect and recognition. And I hope, as imperfect as he is, his legacy, if given due credit and proper assessment, could serve as an inspiration for hopefully even better generation of leaders for the Philippines and around the region in the coming decades. I'm not very optimistic in the coming years, but in the coming decades na lang. All right? Okay, maraming salamat. Thank you very much for that. Again, tomorrow marami pa tayong pag-usapan. Yung Taiwan, by the way, my latest development again. So I have also articles I'm working on with respect to Taiwan. Nancy Pelosi's, I think she already kickstarted her Asia tour. So let's see the situation there. And, medyo delikado rin yan. Medyo kabado rin kami watching, what China would do in response and whether Nancy Pelosi will go all the way. I was looking at the tweets of friends in Taiwan. Some of them were saying exciting days for Taiwan. So it looks like they're anticipating Nancy Pelosi visiting. As you can see, medyo nagbablush tayo, nag-red tayo, so that's exhaustion. So I'll try to end this a little bit sooner. Wala tayong alaskador today. Straight to the point tayo. Thank you very much again kay Jella. Ayan, mga supporters talaga natin dyan. Kay Katrina Paladin Frias, kay Mitch Tengcho. Sabi niya, thank you for another great discussion. High respects for politicians who didn't create their own dynasty, right? Thank you kay Ma'am Eunice Babalcon, kay Immortal Nileve, kay Ma'am Fanny San Miguel. Thank you very much. She's Senan Makalala. Sabi niya, thank you for tonight's meta. You're right, FDR was not a perfect president. Of course, but who was, right? But he was a good one, right? I mean, overall, right? Or at least better than practically everyone else in recent memory, right? Marilee Nopia, thank you very much. Kay Angat Alomites, kay Joy Quinto, kay Rovelyn Catalogo, kay Zio Coco, thank you very much. Kay Jing Ilagan, Rizal Reyes, thank you again so much. Kay Ma'am Jocelyn Lumberio, yan, thank you for effort and patience. Yeah, actually, pahinga tayo ulit soon. Taiwan naman natupag natin. Thank you kay Chariz Almatra. Thank you kay Vilma Alberto. By the way, na-post ko yung interview ko ng 6 a.m. with BBC. Just right after writing all of those obituaries. So I don't know kung medyo sabog ako doon, but I hope I got the message across. So please also feel free to check that interview among others. I posted a longer version of that, or I think I'll be posting a longer version of that on my different platforms. So please check that out. So again, we're not here to write, empty paeans or, peroration, in praise of some person, just because we had, dahil mabait siya sa akin or something like that. As I said, when I met President Ramos, I raised a lot of these issues. And a lot of times people say, tawagin mo na lang si Ambet, di ba? But you know, I don't know. I don't know. I just feel Cory, Ramos, these people, they deserve a better assessment and overview of their legacy. Hindi itong extremes na yung on one side, they were perfect, etc. On the other side, sila yung kasalanan, silang pakanan ng lahat. No, we need something more fair. We need something that is realistic, that is objective, and at the same time is something that they truly deserve, no? So, yon. So, this is my humble attempt at a kind of a judicious overview of their legacy in a very short span of time. So, please check my obituary written for Ramos. I wrote this obituary for him, The Complicated Legacy of Fidel Ramos. God forbid, the obituary I wrote about Ramos. You can also find a Nikkei, the obituary I wrote for President Aquino. So, each of them, I think Aquino was really a good transitional leader, but not transformational. I think Ramos had his shares of mistakes and shortcomings, but he was a great redemptive president and perhaps the most competent we have had in half a century. So in a way, as wrenching as it was writing about their legacy, in many ways it also gave me hope about the country, After all, hindi purong trapo at kurakot lang nagiging mga leaders natin. We still have people who care, who have patriotism, who are competent and very hardworking. Ayoko ng tamad talaga. Ayoko ng tamad. Ayoko ng bara-bara. Alright? I want people who think, who work hard, who put in the work and do their assignment. I think Ramos was definitely one of those guys. So whatever you want to call him, boy this, boy that, don't forget the boy corrupt, boy dictator, boy tamad, boy absent, alright? Lahat mga ibang boy na yan, alright? Okay, umayos kayo. And if I see disrespect there in the comments, I'm gonna come after you, alright? Umayos kayo, alright? And dun sa mga nakinig, nag-behave, and supportive sa atin, thank you very much. I appreciate your support. As you can see, medyo, naubusan na tayo. So, tomorrow, hopefully, we can have further discussions and all, and hopefully, mas fresh tayo by that time. Thank you very much, guys. God bless you, and thank you very much. Hasta mañana.